Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius Podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out. And I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now, to our guest.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. A quick note about the foundation, where we've embarked on our massive literature review of 5,000 plus sources on anxiety and depression, what causes it, how to treat it, etc. The goal here is to assemble a low-cost or no-cost resource for people suffering or people that know people that are suffering. So to find out more, go to findinggeniusfoundation.org. And today, my guest is Carrie Wrigley. She's an author of what's called Your Happiness Toolkit Workbook, 16 strategies for overcoming depression and building a joyful, fulfilling life. So, Carrie, thank you for coming.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your journey. How did you interact or intersect with anxiety and depression?
Well, it goes back for me about as far as I go back. I was born into a family that has certainly experienced some tendencies toward depression and anxiety. You know, from the time I arrived in my family, I was the oldest of 7 children, and certainly had my own bouts, particularly starting in college with some of those afflictions, and started looking for answers. And, because I was a poor college student, I didn't have money for therapy. I certainly didn't have money for doctors or anything like that. So I started looking for some self-help strategies first to help myself, and ultimately was so much helped by those things that I decided to shift gears professionally and become a licensed clinical social worker. I've now been a counselor, a licensed clinical social worker for just over 30 years. And during that time, I've continued, as it sounds like you have, a search for answers to help myself, my family, and certainly my clients and others that my influence can reach. I've taught a number of classes for over 20 years now on these kinds of topics. This book that you mentioned, the Happiness Toolkit Workbook, is actually a second book. The first one is the original book, which was published in 2019, Your Happiness Toolkit, 16 Strategies for Overcoming Depression and Building a Joyful, Fulfilling Life. And that book, both of the books actually, are a reflection of the 16 strategies that I found most useful over the years in my own life and in my practice as a counselor to help myself, my family members, and others. Again, as you mentioned, with low or no cost, self-help, healing from inside out kinds of strategies. And so it's been exciting over the years. I've been in private practice now for just over 10 years and I've been a counselor for over 30. It's been exciting to see how people can actually heal when they do things in an active way that helps them to heal from the inside out, rather than just expecting somebody or something from the outside to provide some external relief.
What does that mean? Like, what is it? Just mean it's self-induced, that you took action to help yourself, or is it different than that? Is it a different nuance?
It basically is action to help yourself, action and insights and perspectives adopted. So it's partly cognitive, adopting ideas that are healing, and yes, engaging in actions that are healing. And I think we're very fortunate in this day and age to live in a time when so many, not just me, but so many have documented their journey and their discoveries, so that when we find ourselves in a position of needing to help ourselves or others, personally or professionally, there is already a rich repository of ideas that can guide our actions and guide, the replacement of thoughts and actions that otherwise can lead us in a downward spiral. Basically what I've found is it ends up coming down to this. There are certain things that make us worse emotionally and physically, and there are certain things that make us better emotionally and physically, and they go together and they're consistent over time. And the things that make us better fight depression and anxiety and addiction and relationship problems and anger and so on and so on. And things that make us worse tend to make us worse across the board and all those different things. And so when you kind of crack the code, you're not just, I went in, initially studying depression because so many of my clients were suffering from that. But I've since found that, again, the things that work, and the things that don't work. And the things that generate wellness and resilience and strength work across the board. And so, once people learn those skills, those strategies, those tools for themselves, they can do a tremendous amount of good, not just for themselves and their families, but in sharing and spreading those with others.
Well, all right. So what are some of the things that work and what are some of the things that don't? Maybe the more surprising ones or just the ones that plain work or not?
Sure. The number one thing that doesn't work is getting dependent on someone else to make you happy. And there's a lot of different ways people can do that. We live in a day and age when we're inundated with, advertising and, media influences that if only we have this product or buy this thing or get this medication or get this treatment, then, we'll finally be well and happy. It's been my experience that happiness never, ever comes from the outside. A certain amount of relief, a certain amount of not feeling alone, a certain amount of that kind of relief can come from the outside. But really healing comes from the inside, of doing the hard work of changing thoughts and behaviors that don't work and trading them in for things that do work. For example, one of the things that clearly doesn't work is focusing on the negative, which unfortunately we live in a world, particularly a media system, that does that literally on a 24/7 cycle. News is literally defined as the worst possible things that happen in the entire planet over the last few hours. With our eyes glued to that screen. And I think that's one of the reasons that we have more depression, more anxiety than we ever have, because we have that very negatively charged literal view of the world that literally zooms the camera in on everything that's wrong and very rarely even comments on the things that are positive. We can recognize that tendency in ourselves and in our world and literally choose to trade it in for looking for and nurturing, cultivating the things that are positive, the things that are good, the things that are worth appreciating. So that's one of the simplest. Even little children can be taught to do that. And in fact, a lot of little kids are way better naturally at that than we are. When I became a grandmother a few years ago, I was in the midst of a very contentious political environment, and I was feeling pretty down about the way things were going. And I happened to take a walk in a real pretty wilderness area close to my home with my new little grandson, who was about 6 months old at the time. And to see his joy at a tree with flowers on it, or to the mountains, or the sun, or just the beauties of the world, it opened my eyes all over again to the fact that this world is amazing. It has beautiful, amazing things and people in it. And I'd been so busy glued to my screen noticing everything that was wrong, I hadn't even noticed. I had to learn from my 6-month-old son how to remember that the world was good. And it was a really important lesson.
Yeah, I remember with kids, it's nice because you could relive the holidays and, holidays you don't care about anymore, like Thanksgiving or Halloween, and you dress up again and you do pumpkins. It's pretty cool to be reintroduced to that, the excitement of it.
Yeah. That's been one of the things that's been really interesting about assembling these 16 strategies, because certainly I have strategies in my toolkit that I've assembled, from all this careful study over 30 years that are more heavy duty, that require a, significant investment of effort, learning curve, and so on. Things like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, incredibly powerful, but it takes a lot of time to learn. It takes a lot of effort. And so that's, in my toolkit, that's number 14 out of 16. I don't start people with it because they're not going to get relief from it right away, because there's things that they'll need to, to get to. Whereas things like, this simple thing of positivity, again, that's something that we came loaded with. So in the way that I assembled the toolkit, the first 5 things, the first 5 tools are literally things like that we literally were born into this world with. I call them innate skills. And because we've all had some experience with them just in the early normal process of life, we may have lost track of them over the years. We have to remember them and dust them off, but we've all had some experience with them. So those are the easiest to learn.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
What do you mean? Like, what's an example of some of the easiest first things you can do to help yourself?
So I'll tell you. Tool number 1 is the principle of action. You know, if you've had kids or if you've even observed kids are constantly active and involved. Even, babies, even in the womb, they're moving, they're stretching, they're discovering things, they're in motion. Action is consistent with happiness. It's when we tend to be inactive and not do anything and sit there, that's one of the things that tends into a downward spiral. And I find so often with my clients who are depressed or otherwise struggling emotionally, they've settled into this pattern of just kind of sitting there, either sitting there watching media or sitting there thinking depressing thoughts inside their own head. We call that rumination, just this unproductive pattern of just thinking and thinking and thinking in negative ways, rather than engaging in action, in joyful action to actually do something, to actually build something. So action is the first principle that, again, every child is born with. The second one is feeling. No newborn has to be taught to cry when they're scared or when they're hungry or when they're sad. And similarly, they don't need to be taught how to gurgle, when they're comforted or when they feel their mother close by or when they hear a familiar voice. We come loaded with the capacity to feel. But over the process of time, if we're not careful, and because of some life experiences that we might have in this world, we might be taught not to have permission to feel what we feel and to sort of close it off and shut it down and pretend we don't feel what we actually feel. I found for so many of my clients and others that I've worked with, regaining that capacity to even notice what we actually feel, to be there with it, even if it's painful, to feel our genuine pain or sorrow or hunger or disappointment or whatever, rather than just pretend that we're feeling something that we're not. We can't feel joy if we're not capable of feeling sorrow and pain, all that kind of stuff. We either have the system on or off, and kids are born with it on, and we can learn to turn it back on again. And then number 3 is the one I mentioned before, positivity rather than negativity. Number 4 is learning. Again, kids are learning from the time that they're born, probably before that. They learn to hold their heads up. They learn to, navigate in space, to stand on their own little legs, to talk, to walk, and we're born to engage in that kind of joyful process of always discovering something new, of learning things. And that process of lifelong learning can be such a continuous, joyful part of our existence from babyhood to death, really. But again, sometimes we just kind of settle into complacency and, falling into ruts of what we already know, what we've already done, what's already, familiar to us. Even if it doesn't work, it's what we know. So it's what we do. Well, learning is such a powerful path out of that kind of passivity and complacency. And then finally, the last one, creativity, is the last of these 5 that I think we're really born with. I know about you, but my little kids came into this world singing songs and coloring, on the walls and experimenting with the sound of their voices and so on. It's just natural for kids to be creative. In the world that we live in, we're taught to kind of turn off our creativity and just sort of regurgitate back what we're told and, buy the already made product with somebody else's dance or somebody else's creation or somebody else's painting or somebody else's food rather than create things ourselves. There's a joy in creation that we literally were born with. So those 5 things, action, feeling, positivity, learning, creativity. Those are the things that are in the first level of this happiness toolkit that I found had worked for me, and it's worked for so many.
But what if you get the kit and you're experiencing none of those things, or you feel like it's very difficult to experience any of those things, and you look at it and you're like, sure, it sounds great, but how do I do it?
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
I find that there's always some tiny element of one of those things, one or more of those things that people can do, like on the positivity thing, for example. I have yet to find a client who was so far down they couldn't find a single thing at all to notice and to write down. I give people the first week an assignment, for example, to keep a gratitude journal. It's easy, They can find something to notice, even if it's just, the sky happens to be blue today, or their kid said something funny, or, they actually got paid on time for a change, or their hair flipped the right way for a change. I mean, just simple things. It doesn't have to be rocket science, or as far as action, they may not be able to run a marathon today, but they could maybe walk out to their mailbox today and pick up the mail, or they can't clean their entire house today, but maybe they could throw away a few of the things in their junk drawer or something like that. So whittling it down to things that they can do. I have yet to meet somebody who's so far down they literally couldn't do anything whatsoever. And these 5 things, somewhere in those 5 things tends to be where people are most likely to start having some success in some of the small things that can get them going in a positive direction.
So that's good. Is there a formula where you tell someone to pick one thing or 3 things, or how do they not get overwhelmed, and how do they make sure they keep ascending mentally and feeling better?
Well, it's one of the reasons that I've written these out in the book, and then most recently the workbook, so that they basically have resources that they can scan and then decide where to start. It's different for everybody, so it's not formulaic. I as I mentioned, most of my clients, I start with the gratitude journal, but some I don't. Some need to start with getting more physical activity. Some need to start by playing with their kids more. Some need to start by getting more sleep, or whatever it might be. But having options laid out for them in advance, they can quickly scan through and say, I already do pretty good with this one. This one I'm not so great with, but I remember a time when I used to do better with this particular thing, and a lot of times that's the easiest place to start, is to, strengthen anew something that they had already done at some level in the past, even if it's just by very, very small degrees. And it typically is at first.
So is it like a cornucopia of things they could do, and they're supposed to pick one each day? Or what's the record? How do people interact with the workbook?
Not necessarily. Usually I'll start people with, a particular assignment, and they do, normally I see my clients once a week, let's say. And so they'll pick maybe 1 or 2 things to focus on that week. So like week 1, maybe they'll do the gratitude journal and maybe try to eat more vegetables rather than so many sweets. Let's say they do that for a week. And then the next week they come in and they keep that, and then they maybe add, a little bit more exercise. They maybe add, expressing something that they've been, bottling up, even if it's in a journal or something. So we'll kind of add things over the process of time. I think it'd be really confusing to kind of flip it around every single day when people are first learning. But over the process of time, being able to quickly scan through the various elements of the toolbox and say, in the circumstance I'm dealing with now, this would be most useful. But that tends to be the most helpful after people are already acquainted. And anything new is going to take a while to learn or to relearn. You're not going to do everything at once. So that's why I just assign 1 or 2 things each time.
Yeah. What if someone picks a thing, but they need more examples of how to engage in the thing? Maybe it sounds silly, like it should be obvious, but you have, a list of like, okay, you're going to exercise today. Here's like 30 suggestions on really simple stuff you can do to get your heart going.
I have quite a lot of those kinds of resources in the book and workbook, like in the action chapter. I have an exercise called the recreational survey that has, I can't remember exactly, probably 10 or 15 different areas, like exercise and learning and creativity, whatever, and then has maybe 5 or 6 different suggestions within each of those things. So people can just go, circle the things that they've have some personal interest in, because some of the things that might be joyful action for me might be really boring or hard or overwhelming to somebody else, and vice versa. For example, my son, one of his favorite action strategies that really brings him joy is to go mountain bike. that's like a 10 out of 10 joyful experience for him, especially if it's a really technical trail and he's, going up really steep, heights and having to navigate, around very difficult passages. That basically is just a recipe for me getting hurt. So that is not a recipe for my joy, going, mountain biking on very, very complex trails like that. For me, I prefer to maybe sing and dance and lift weights. And, for some people, the concept of singing is terrifying. So we're very customized in the things that bring us joy. And so for each of the strategies, I've developed worksheets and handouts where people can kind of scan through the different options and find that particular customized mix that is most likely to work for them personally, because it's going to be different than for anybody else.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. What kind of situations do people have that make them most likely to come to you and say, hey, I need help, or to buy your book or to engage with you?
I see a wide range of clients. Far and away, the most common is depression, people that are depressed. And, it's becoming a very close second, anxiety. Sometimes I'll have people come in because of relationship problems or addiction, most especially sexual or pornography addiction has become really, really common in the last few years. I'll see a lot of people that are simply dealing with a sense of just malaise, especially if they've gone through a major transition in their life, like retirement or graduation or the birth of a first child or their last child leaving home, leaving them an empty nester. And they're not really sure what to do with themselves, And so sometimes they'll kind of fall into a little bit of depression, low self-esteem, anxiety, sometimes not. But in any case, they need to develop a new sense of direction. And so those tend to be the kinds of situations that most commonly bring people to me.
So what's the interaction like with the workbook? Are they working with you on the workbook, or they go through it themselves and it's guided, or how does it happen?
It depends on the individual. I mean, the workbook itself has only been out for about 6 weeks, and I've been a counselor for 10 years, and so for 30 years. And so basically, the workbook has actually been a really, really wonderful tool to focus and expedite the work I've already been doing with clients. Because, for 30 years, what I've done is help people identify, here's what's not working, so let's replace it with this. Now it's just they have the workbook to refer to. So I have a number of clients now that the workbook is available that do go through, they're still meeting with me once a week to sort of report on their progress and to get some more insights and to help them if they get stuck. But certainly the workbook is developed in such a way that people can work step by step through the various exercises and then refer back to the original book, which has a lot more detail and a lot more stories and background and stuff, if they need some extra insight. But that's usually what we do is, depending on the person's needs, I'll still, as a counselor, meet with them the first week to sort of get a sense of what their needs are, what their questions, what their issues are, make some initial suggestions, get them started, ordering the book or whatever. But I still usually give them some initial exercises to get started with that I found to be helpful, things that are in the workbook that they'll eventually get to, but I give it to them when they first come in. And then, we sort of build on that basis. And from week to week, it really is interesting how people's different paths, different needs unfold. And like I say, no one individual is the same as another.
Do people graduate from the workbook and they go on to a second one, or is it it's just an ongoing resource for them that they use periodically?
It can be an ongoing resource. I mean, it starts, as I mentioned, with those kind of innate skills sort of things that are fairly easy to capture. It ends with things that are harder. In all honesty, I myself, who wrote the book, have not fully mastered. I don't think anybody of us as human beings has. The last 3 skills, which are the hardest and the most complex, are thinking tool, which basically is cognitive therapy of identifying thought patterns that bring you down and replacing them with patterns that work better for you. Even as the author of this book, I sometimes catch myself in a negative moment when I kind of, a negative thought gets a hold of me and I have to turn that around. So in that instance, it is kind of a lifetime thing. Tool 15, the second hardest, I call the connection tool, which is basically how to create methods for creating positive connection with other human beings, in terms of positive communication, relationships. Those things, unlike the tool 1 through 5 that we talked about before, those don't come naturally to us. We aren't naturally unselfish. We aren't naturally, patient and kind and communicate and speak in iMessages and stuff. We don't naturally do that. That is literally a lifetime venture to learn how to connect and communicate productively with other people. And then finally, the last one, tool number 16, which is the most demanding of all, is healing, meaning healing from past pain, past trauma, grief, those kinds of things. I don't know that there's any of us, myself included, who are ever going to be done 100% with all of the 16 things, So it is kind of an ongoing journey, but it's a step-by-step journey that's a lot easier when you have some signposts to refer to rather than just kind of wandering around in the dark.
Do you recommend that people work with a therapist with this workbook if they don't work with you?
It really depends on their needs and also depends obviously on their resources. Certainly the book and so many of the other things I've developed over the years are intended for people to either work as I did without the benefit of a therapist, or I think people do make efficient progress if they work with a therapist, but obviously not everybody has that option, And it also kind of depends on the kind of therapist. Unfortunately, there are therapists and treatments and technologies that I think, in all honesty, do more harm than good in building dependency, in focusing people too quickly on, their traumas and their difficulties and their whatever before they really give them some coping strategies from the beginning to deal with. In other words, they sort of start with tool 16, let's deal with all the pain and trauma and horribleness of your past and figure out whose fault it is that you're miserable. And I find a lot of times that does more harm than good, So it really depends on the individual's needs and on the resources that are available to them. I think in general, if it's possible to, have access to the book and at the same time, be able to work through those things with the support of another skilled, practitioner, that's ideal. But certainly, it can work the other way as well.
What about forming groups where they do like a book club of your book? Like this week, the group's going to go over this particular chapter and everyone can practice the skill. And, what if it turns into like a group therapy type thing where people, again, go through the book as almost as like a Bible study in a way? It's
a really cool idea. Again, the books are, the workbook is only 6 weeks old and the book itself is only 2 years old. So to my knowledge, nobody's ever tried that. But I think it's a really cool idea and I think it could be really, helpful. Kind of similar to what groups have done over the years with the 12 steps, or like you say, Bible study. I think there can be tremendous power in people, sharing their ideas and their insights and saying, hey, this is the phrase that really spoke to me and this was my experience with it. And then, kind of launching that sort of synergy and exchange with other people, I think can be really cool.
So for people to get the book, where should they go? And then if people want to work with you directly, how can they do so?
Sure. The book is really easy to find. The easiest way to get to it, of course, is on Amazon. You just either put in my name, Carrie Wrigley, or the main title, Your Happiness Toolkit. It leads you right to both the book, which, like I say, was called Your Happiness Toolkit, or this newer workbook, which is Your Happiness Toolkit Workbook. They're part of a series, so you find one, you're led to the other. Basically, the difference between the two is the book is 440 pages, goes into all the detail, all the backstory, and so on. The good thing about it is it's really thorough. The bad thing about it can be kind of overwhelming if people have limited time or energy. And so for that reason, I came up with a second book, the workbook, which is much more visual, much more action-oriented. They work fantastic together. And like I say, on Amazon, if you find one, you find the other. And as far as working with me or tapping into some of the other resources I have available, easiest way to do that is by means of my website, carriewrigley.com. That's spelled CarrieWrigley.com. I have links on there to not just the books, but a number of videos, information about how to work with me personally if people choose to do that, free downloads of some sort of starter kits that people can start working with even before getting the book, and a number of other resources that may be useful.
Well, very good. And that's the best way to find you is go to Amazon and look up Your Happiness Toolkit.
Well, that for the book specifically, and then for the other information regarding me and my other materials to carriewrigley.com.
Excellent. Very good. Well, Carrie, thank you for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.